welcome to the 16th Annual Durfee Lecture, hosted by the Department of Philosophy and Religion. My name is Jin Park. I'm professor and chair of the department. This annual Durfee Lecture began by the generous donation by Harold and Doris Durfee. And Harold Durfee was the professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. And when he retired, he generously donated some funds so that we can start this annual speaker series in religious studies. So every year, every spring, we bring a distinguished scholar in the field of religious studies so that AU community can have an opportunity to hear this kind of cutting-edge scholarship and really think about various issues that we care for. So today we have a really great speaker about whom you will hear soon. So before we move on, let me just read a brief statement about the land of acknowledgement. American University is located on the territories of the Piscataway, Powhatan, and Nantico people. We recognize that our ability to gather here today is due to the continued occupation of this land. In recognizing that this land is colonized indigenous territory that has been crafted through slavery and indentured labor, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate the histories and afterlives of these events and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. So now I will invite Professor to formally introduce our speaker, but before that also we have students just trying to take a moment to introduce their call for paper and journal, right? So please come forward.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming out today. We just are excited to announce the revival of the AU Pharmacon Journal of Philosophy and Religion. We put out a call for papers and we're going to start, our deadline is next Friday. We're super excited to relaunch this project and do some excellent things for the AU Philosophy and Religion community for both undergraduates and graduates.
Sure.
Tell us who you are.
How we are? Okay.
Sure. I'm Henry Monshine.
My name is Andrew Wagner.
Woo. I'm Lexi Callaher.
So yeah, if you're an undergraduate at American University, or if you're visiting American University and you're a student within the DC Consortium or the larger DMV area, we'd really love to hear from you and to get a submission from you guys. We're looking for submissions from 2,500 to 3,500 words on any topic in philosophy and religious studies. And we'd love to hear what you have to say. We'd love to hear your insights. Lexi, do you have anything else to add?
Like Henry said, the soft deadline is next Friday, but we are accepting submissions kind of roughly through spring break. So if that helps at all.
Great. We have some handouts, a sample of our call for papers on the table out there. So please feel free to take some if you are interested. And I think that's it, so we're going to pass it off to Dr. Buck.
Good evening. Good to see you all. Welcome. Before introducing our lecturer this evening, I'm going to say a brief word about the format. Concluding the lecture, we'll have a time for Q&A, so I encourage you to be thinking about any inquiries you'd like to ask about. That said, I am thrilled to introduce Ellen T. Armour as our 2024 Durfee Lecturer. Dr. Armour is E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Chair and Professor of Feminist Theology at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Graduate Department of Religion, where she directs the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality. She holds affiliated appointments in the Department of Philosophy and the Women's and Gender Studies Program at Vanderbilt, and was a faculty fellow at the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities in 2017 and 2018. Her research interests are in feminist theology, contemporary continental philosophy, and theories of sexuality, race, gender, disability, and embodiment. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, she is the author of Signs and Wonders, Theology After Modernity, Columbia University Press in 2016. Deconstruction, Feminist Theology, and the Problem of Difference, Subverting the Race-Gender Divide, New Chicago Press, 1999. and co-editor of Bodily Citations, Judith Butler and Religion, Columbia University Press, 2006. Her latest book, from Columbia University Press, published just last year, is entitled Seeing and Believing: Religion, Digital Visual Culture, and the Struggle for Social Justice. As you may have seen on your way in, there are discount codes for 20% off that new book at the back table, and I encourage you to grab along the way. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Armour, whose lecture this evening is entitled Seeing and Believing: Social Media and Social Justice.
Well, thanks first to you, Nick, if you don't hear me. Thanks first to Nick for that lovely introduction, and to all of you for being here, and to Jen and all your colleagues for hosting me. It's a real honor and a real pleasure to be with you tonight. And I hope that what I have to say will prompt some good conversation during the Q&A. I look forward to that. Well, I presume I don't have to convince you that the stakes of our investments in seeing and believing are particularly high these days, thanks to the advent of digital photography and social media. That is in no small part due to how deeply intertwined our real lives have become with our virtual lives. Digital technologies, smartphones, complete with increasingly powerful digital cameras, and social media platforms and the affordances they offer are really transforming our individual, communal, and political lives. We like, share, post, tweet, or retweet what captures our attention, often by catching our eye with a visual depiction. We call social media our new public square. How is this new visually saturated public square, this new visually saturated media landscape, huh?
Yeah.
Is it social media? Now it's on, okay, there. Now I can hear me? Do I need to start over? Okay. How is this new visually saturated public square, this new visually saturated media landscape affecting us, particularly when it comes to struggles for social justice? Well, scholars such as Zeynep Tufekci, who actually writes for the New York Times, and you may have run into her work before, document the positive but fragile impact that global connectivity has on political organizing. That's done by social media. She documents the critical role that social media, like Twitter and Facebook in particular, played not only in mobilizing and organizing people to participate in the Arab Spring, that's her chief example, but in generating material help from supporters spread all over the world and far outside the world. Supporters of those protests use social media to organize the collection and delivery of material goods, medical supplies, food, etc., to help to Tahrir Square, to help sustain the efforts of the protesters that were there. But Tufekci also shows that sustaining protest movements and using them to produce real change still requires good, old-fashioned person-to-person organizing. While digital technologies and social media help keep folks in touch, they're no substitute for in real life connections, IRL connections, right, as we call it. Other scholars are considerably more skeptical of social media's contributions to social change. They point out that we inhabit self-curated virtual worlds that allow us to see only what we already believe, thus reinforcing those beliefs and ways of seeing. One scholar, Eli Pariser, calls these virtual worlds filter bubbles. Of course, to call them self-curated is a bit misleading. As Pariser himself observes, our screens are increasingly, yes, a one-way mirror reflecting our own interests. But that's thanks to algorithmic observers who watch what we click and use that data to determine what we see and what we want. The algorithms are developed owned and deployed by multinational corporations that also monetize what we post and share. What Shoshana Zuboff has dubbed surveillance capitalism. She's another scholar whose work you might see. And as another scholar, Sophia Noble, has shown, those algorithms too often reinforce socially embedded biases. I'll tell you just one brief story that she tells. She was getting ready to host her niece and one of her niece's friends at her house for the evening. And so looking for something that might be really fun and unusual and different to do, she Googled young black girls. Guess what came up? Porn sites. Porn sites. Now Google has since fixed that, but you know, the very fact that that's what happened, it tells you something. And yet, studies have shown that the still photographs that we encounter on our new public square, the still photographs, especially about socially and ethically charged issues, can have a positive effect on viewers' moral judgments. Intriguingly, that's less true of moving or video images, which kind of surprised me. Of course, words also contribute to volatility and virality, it turns out. Research has also shown that adding a single moral or emotional word to a tweet on a divisive political issue, they studied gun control, same-sex marriage, and climate change, increased its expected retweet rate by double digits on all three topics. That's a phenomenon that they dub moral contagion. Indian post-colonial theorist Pramod Nayar argues that our globalized, digitized, mediatized world makes possible what he calls global witness citizenship. Global witness citizenship is significantly grounded in dissident surveillance, he calls it. Unlike governmental surveillance, whose goal is control, dissident surveillance is a practice of self-surveillance that individual citizens undertake in order to protect civic structures that in turn protect and nurture us as civil citizens. Like Tufekci, Nayar recognizes that today's global virtual networks make possible the recognition, documentation, and response to the often grievous harms that human beings experience. Significantly, visual media lie at the heart of this potential on history. Thanks to the global digital networks and social media platforms that interact with them and support them, eyewitnesses are able to share instantly videos or still photos of local instances that they're witnessing of suffering or injustice or violence, and to reach a potentially at least global audience. We've seen that happen, in fact, right? We're watching it now with thousands. Nayar's focus, though, is on the opportunity and obligation that digital networks afford to those who seek such visual documentation. Those encounters give viewers the opportunity to respond by embracing the role of global witness citizen, a role that, with governments weakened by neoliberalism, is particularly critical, Nayar argues. But to take up this opportunity to actually become a global witness citizen requires more than simply looking. To do that requires looking deeply into what the visual image opens up and opens onto. To see in the image connections between self and other, between previous instances of violence or violation and this one, between one's own local context and the one to which you might have only virtual and visual access. The response from many around the world to the photographs of the body of Alan Kurdi, a toddler and Syrian refugee whose body washed up on a Turkish beach, is a case in point. There are numerous media outlets that documented a dramatic increase in material support for Syrian refugees in the wake of their publication. And that was sustained for weeks and months. People took refugees into their homes, for example. People collected goods to get to them in the camps where they were being held, et cetera, et cetera. Just one illustration of the power. This talk is based on my recently published book, Seeing and Believing: Religion, Digital Visual Culture, and Social Justice. That book is a sequel of sorts to my 2016 book, Signs and Wonders: Theology After Modernity. Both books focus on photography's role in the social justice issues that we confront. Those issues are the effects, I argue in Signs and Wonders, and Reprise in Seeing and Believing, of the outworking of two forms of power, modern power specifically, that the philosopher Michel Foucault identifies. They're called biopower and disciplinary power. This is going to be a bit nerdy, but I promise it'll make sense. I call it biodisciplinary power for short. Sovereign power is probably power as we usually think of it, right? Power over. And it's, of course, still present, still around. He talks about sovereign power as the most ancient form of power, which is embodied in the sovereign's right to kill. That remains still true, right? Think about the United States, which is one of the countries that still has the death penalty, right? So that's an example. But sovereign power has been supplemented by these relatively new forms of power, coursing through modern institutions like prisons, clinics, and asylums, as well as the modern school, workplace, and family. Disciplinary power is, as I describe it, a system of carrots and sticks that seeks to mold human beings into docile subjects. Avowed delinquents, compliant patients, obedient workers, and best of all, good boys and girls. Biopower harnesses disciplinary power to serve its goal of nurturing the human race by eliminating social and biological abnormality. While abnormality is to be found throughout the human race, it has an uncanny knack for showing up and finding a stubbornly resistant host in certain populations, colonized or formerly enslaved people, for example. It is no coincidence that the population of our prison system is so much, that those prison systems are populated by people of color, particularly Black people. That's not a coincidence. So thus these populations, colonized people, formerly enslaved people and their descendants, feel biodisciplinary power's most virulent and violent effects in concentrated form. That said, we all live out our lives in biodisciplinary power as well. And by all of us, I mean all of us, no matter where we live in this world. And that's thanks largely to colonialism, which was aided and abetted by Christianity, and its heir, globalization. Photography is central to the establishment and circulation of biodisciplinary power, and it in turn to photographic practice, and that includes questions about seeing and believing, and in fact prompts them. Whether we can believe what a particular photograph purports to show us, or what I call photographic truth, was a question from photography's inception, believe it or not. People did not automatically assume that the camera was this light pencil that just boom, you could put it in its what was there. In turn, photography was essential to realizing biodisciplinary power's drive toward normalization. There are all kinds of examples of that I gave in Science and Wonders. Colonialism and racism, anchored by modern sexuality, were and are very critical players here, central players. And here's the thing, both casual snapshots, family photographs, for example, like this one, this is my family from the 1970s. So casual snapshots, family snapshots, and professional photographs, think about mugshots, circulate by a disciplinary power. Subjecting oneself to the camera, willingly or unwillingly, as its viewed object or viewing subject, entrains us in modes of seeing and being seen that are integral to modernity as a way of knowing, doing, and therefore being. That doesn't mean that we always comply. You'll notice my youngest brother here is hardly complying with what it is to be a good boy, right? He's making fun of me. That's a matter of fact. But lo and behold, look, he grew up. This picture is from his wedding in 2001. Clearly he learned. He got trained. He knows how he's supposed to behave now. Right? But photography's role in the circulation of biodisciplinary power and our ongoing subjection to it involves more than a given photograph's that there then, as I call it, or what photographs index. It also involves what I call photographic affect. That is, what photographs open up and onto, and how they move us emotionally and sometimes to take action. We speak of certain photographs as iconic, as able to stand in for the events they reference because they capture what's at stake in those events with remarkable pathos and power. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this particular photograph. It's called Migrant Mother. It was taken by Dorothea Lange, a very famous photographer who worked for the Works Progress Administration during the Depression and was sent out to document the effects of the Depression on people. And this particular photograph is credited with advancing support for the New Deal in the 40s. In their aptly titled study, No Caption Needed, Iconic Photographs, Public Culture, and Literal Democracy, communications scholars Robert Harriman and John Lewis Lukacs argue that iconic photographs are what they call circuits of political affect that arise out of situations of social conflict or crisis. By concentrating and directing emotions, they serve as, quote, aesthetic resources for performative mediation of conflicts. That's asking a lot from a photograph, right? But iconic photographs are organic. And yet the same photograph can move us, as we say, emotionally and to take action in very different ways. That's a dynamic I call photographic ambivalence. Well, I developed these concepts starting in the early 2000s with old-fashioned analog photography in mind, and the visual culture of which it was a part. Of course, everything has changed about our photographic lives since then, thanks to the now ubiquitous cell phone camera and the explosion of social media. And yet I argue in Seeing and Believing that digital visual culture only amplifies the issues of photographic truth and photographic affect and the larger issues they raise for us. And not just on our virtual lives, but our real lives too. It is not just for our virtual lives, but for our real lives too. As I said earlier, our new media landscape is saturated, oversaturated, some say, with photographs and other visual images, all digitally produced. Can we believe what we see? Can we trust that a photograph faithfully represents its alleged that and thing? The analog camera transcribes objects into images, according to one scholar, Liz Reynolds. But the digital camera converts them into binary code. Isn't that interesting? And there's a lot at stake in that difference. Indeed, it's always been possible, well, the analog camera, as I said, does that. This impacts what's in a photograph, what you're going to see in a photograph. If you enlarge an analog photograph, you see more detail in the photograph than you knew was there. even if you were the photographer. If you enlarge a digital photograph, and you see less. Eventually it just disintegrates into pixels that actually make it up. The other thing is, it's always been possible to manipulate photographs, but it took some serious know-how to do that to analog photographs. But that's not true for digital photographs, as we all know. We can make all kinds of alterations on our phones right now. Indeed, digital photographs don't even require an object, nor do they require light, for that matter. One can create them out of whole cloth, that is, whole digital cloth, out of bits, out of code. Which raises the question for me, should we even call them photographs, light writing? That's what that word means, at all. But even if we decide we can trust a given digital photograph's that then there, how do we navigate what it opens up and opens onto? The way it moves us, emotionally, or to take action, or fails to. How does what we believe about what's right and good and true in general impact what we see not just in, but through the photo? Seeing and believing is anchored in what I call a photographic storyline that was launched in 2012 in the wake of Trayvon Martin's killing by George Zimmerman, who was, you recall, eventually arrested for murder but subsequently acquitted thanks to Florida's now Stand Your Ground law. To Zimmerman, a young black man walking through a white neighborhood wearing a hoodie, was by default the embodiment of criminality and therefore a threat to be eliminated. Tellingly, a black and white photograph of Martin, this very one, right, this is a part of it, placed contesting that very stereotype at the visual center of the pursuit of justice for Martin on social media and in real life, and for so many other young black folks who were killed for standing their ground. You may remember how often people would pose as Trayvon Martin in a gray hoodie and write, "I am Trayvon." And people would carry posters with those images and that message down in real life protests too. They post the image on Facebook, but then also carry it around with them during protests. So on the one hand, Martin's killing gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. Hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, right? That's how it started. It started as a hashtag, but it became one of the largest global protest movements in history. But that very storyline and now iconic image of Trayvon Martin took an ominous turn when a young Dylan Roof, here on the right, started looking into what happened, and started Googling black on black crime. The virtual rabbit holes that he went down, a lot of them misinformation and disinformation, by the way, led him to try to start a race war, quote unquote, by murdering 9 worshipers at the historic Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And his actions in turn inspired a man in New Zealand to mount a similar attack on worshippers at a mosque, which that man live streamed on Facebook. And those actions have in turn prompted others to take up these kinds of violent actions, including the murderer at Tom's grocery store, for example. So the chain of events goes on. Clearly then, questions about photographic truth and photographic affect remain deeply relevant to digital visual culture's impact on social justice issues. Well, my focus in Signs and Wonders was on photographic subjection, that is, how photography subjects us to biodisciplinary power's normalizing agenda. But as Foucault himself said, quote, "Where there is power, there is resistance." Resistance is my focus in seeing and believing. My goal in this book is to jumpstart what I call photographic insurrection. By that I mean pushing back on photographic subjection. Rather than docile acquiescence to the status quo, might we cultivate the ability to see through biodiscipline photographic normativity and what it would have us believe about ourselves, others, and the world we share? I turn to religious ways of seeing as a catalyst in that pursuit. Well, why religious ways of seeing, you might ask? Well, religions have long wrestled with the relationship between seeing and believing. Pretty much every one of them has to wrestle with that question. Indeed, Christianity, which is the tradition that I work in and with, was arguably born out of a visual crisis of sorts. What to make of an empty tomb? That we speak of iconic photographs at all references the complicated history of the relationship between seeing and believing. Indeed, Christianity, although as I said that, the controversy over the relationship of icons to belief actually divided the Western Christian church from the Eastern church long before the Reformation divided Protestant and Catholic, that we don't often think about the history. Were visual images of Christ and of Christian saints windows onto the divine, and thus worthy of veneration? Or were they its misrepresentations? Were they icons, or were they idols? Suspicions about seeing and believing also funded the Protestant movement, actually. Reformers stripped churches and cathedrals of visual media that they deemed idolatrous. And yet Protestantism can hardly be accused of jettisoning seeing as an aid to believing. John Calvin, for example, exhorted Christians to look instead at nature, where they would encounter the glory of God. And as the religious historian and visual culture scholar David Morgan has argued, modern Christianity went on to invest significantly in visual resources, thanks to the advent of then new media, including the printing press, right, the Gutenberg Bible, movies and television, like that Left Behind series, right, and now digital media. There are a number of religious and religious adjacent organizations that have made visual, that have moved to social media to attract new followers, for example, and who engage their current communities as well. So in the last chapters of Seeing and Believing, I draw on Morgan's more recent work, The Embodied Eye, to curate resources to jumpstart photographic insurrection. I find his work particularly helpful for a number of reasons. For one thing, his approach expands our understanding of seeing and believing. According to Morgan, seeing is much more than simply casting one's eye on a visual object, and believing is much more than, say, mere intellectual assent to a proposition. Both are deeply embodied, enculturated, interactive, and affective practices. Say that again. Deeply embodied, enculturated, interactive, and affective practices. Every word makes it. One cannot disaggregate religious seeing and believing from the full human sensorium. That is all of our senses, with the possible exception of taste. We haven't quite figured out how to get that. And also from the full range of human feeling. Religious seeing takes place in and on visual fields, shaped as much by viewers' larger social context, family background, their nation, social location, and so on, as by their religious affiliation or lack thereof. These visual fields generate multiple and multiform gazes, each of which, quote, disposes viewers toward certain postures toward their world, and the others who inhabit it with them, unquote, as well as toward the transcendent and the divine. Seeing is, in Morgan's words, quote, both a matter of agency and a medium of power. A matter of agency and a medium of power. And believing is a, quote, visual communion between seer and seen, individuals and communities, one's body and the world. Morgan's work also helps us understand how practices of seeing inform not only what we see, but how we feel about ourselves and others, mortal and divine. Gazes that we've been schooled in dispose us to adopt certain attitudes toward what we see. Hence our tendency to see what we believe. Belief here understood as, quote, a disposition to see, hear, feel, or intuit, in alignment with the order of things that we've accepted, consciously or unconsciously, as proper and real. But religious seeing also pulls us beneath the surface and into what a given image opens up and opens onto. That can include challenges to our worldview and to its arguably inevitable idolatries, if you will. Those idolatries may close us off to the sacred or the transcendent, not only to itself or in itself, but as it manifests in the profane and the image, including in one another and the natural world that surrounds us. But there is one more reason why I really like Morgan's gazes. None of his gazes directly address issues of social justice, but every one of these gazes does something that's really important. Every one of them disrupts the hierarchy of seer over seeing that normative ways of seeing reinforce. And that's another very important piece. So Morgan outlines 8 religious gazes drawn primarily from Christian visual culture, but evident in other religious and secular, for that matter, visual cultures as well. And that's critical to my project too. Equally importantly, these gazes draw on ways of seeing that, he argues, quote, come naturally to us. Those of you with a philosophical background think phenomenology, think Merleau-Ponty, if you know what that means. That come naturally to us, to human beings, regardless of religious affiliation or lack thereof. And Morgan intends this particular visual repertoire to be invitational, not exclusive. And that's necessarily the case, given what these gazes reveal about the nature of religious seeing. Some of these gazes would be ephemeral, while others endure. All will come and go and shape-shift, even morph into one another, depending on the context when we practice them. Notably, given my interests here, Morgan has a very expansive notion of what can be objects for these gazes. In addition to explicitly religious visual objects, icons, for example, these gazes are invoked by secular visual objects that invoke, quote, a mythical past, a national destiny, a compelling narrative, a social order, a people, a totemic founder or hero, a place, or a ritual enactment. In other words, the visual objects that inspire religious seeing range from the mundane to the sublime, the ordinary to the extraordinary. In the most obviously religious way of seeing, the devotional gaze, believers submit themselves voluntarily to the religious or artistic visual object in a way that invites a kind of self-transcendence, quote, allowing the devotee to slip the bonds of pain, guilt, fear, or oppression. Sometimes that gaze morphs into the reciprocal gaze, in which a transformative exchange happens between the seer and the seen. The Hindu concept of darshan is an example. Similarly, apparitions of the Virgin Mary are sometimes described that way. Of course, both gazes risk idolatry, reducing the transcendent to the immanent, the infinite to the finite. The aversive gaze avoids idolatry by quote, looking around, unquote, the visual object rather than directly at it, effectively rendering the visual object a veil that shields the divine from view or return. Now you'll recall that per Morgan, ways of seeing are as much social as they are individual. The communal gaze evokes the influence of social settings, worship services, religious festivals, political rallies, for example, on how we see. Social settings can be externally or internally focused. They can be real or they can be virtual. The liminal gaze, quote, marks the edge of us and the beginning of them, he writes, often by trading in stereotypes of those deemed. Via the virtual gaze, we project ourselves into performative interactive spaces that allow us to, quote, vicariously participate, unquote, in ways of being that are very different from our everyday lives. Two examples he gives are Christian passion plays, the reenactment of the passion, or online gaming. Isn't that interesting? Both of those can be examples of virtual. And then religious seers are also visual objects themselves. To be caught in the unilateral gaze of an omnipotent and omniscient God, or the evil eye, renders one, quote, powerless, subject to the manipulative, overwhelming, objectifying gaze of authority. And in response, one may take refuge in the occlusive gaze by putting up yet another visual object, an amulet, say, as a shield. The occlusive gaze, Morgan observes, is analogous to closing one's eyes in shame to avoid another's judgmental gaze. That's just a quick overview of these eight gazes. Isn't that interesting? Kind of work. Okay, it's my claim that this visual repertoire can fund what I'm calling photographic insurrection, a practice of looking, grounded and attending to what certain photographs open up and open onto, including our formation by biodisciplinary power. So what makes me think that these gazes might do that, might fund a more productive relationship with our visually saturated new public square? Well, in the spring of 2021, I taught a course entitled Theology, Visual Culture, and New Media to a group of 15 Vanderbilt Divinity School students, all of whom but one were white. So that's important. Early in the semester, when we had barely begun the deep dive into the course readings, I showed the students the photographs of Trayvon Martin and Joe Ruth. I asked them to write down their responses to whichever image or images moved them, and to keep those responses for further reflection later in our course. Toward the end of the semester, I shared with them the brief description I just shared with you of Morgan's gazes, and I asked them to do two things. First, I asked them to revisit what they'd written about their initial response to the image, and identify which, if any, of the gazes might describe how they had seen that photograph. Then I asked them to revisit one or both of the images and deliberately adopt one of the gazes, their choice, as a way of relooking, ideally differently, and write a new brief reflection. I provided prompts crafted by my fabulous teaching assistant, Debbie Brubaker, to help them. Of course, whether they use those prompts or not, I couldn't tell. So here's what resulted. Of Morgan's 8 gazes, students referenced all but the unilateral gaze. Regardless of the gaze adopted, either intentionally or unintentionally, their responses were visceral and deeply affective. Several described feeling compelled, some at first viewing, to adopt the devotional gaze in response to Martin's photograph. Doing so prompted sobering reflections on the multiple layers of loss, of his future, to his parents and more that resulted from his murder. In addition, a personal connection to the incident prompted one student to reflect on the fear that Martin's murder provoked for a college friend of hers who was a neighbor of Martin's, and of the way their college community rallied around this friend to provide support. Using a reciprocal gaze, established a relationship with Martin's image whose back and forth made one seer feel both heavy. One student reported trying to use the aversive gaze to look away from Martin's image, not to avoid idolatry, but to avoid discomfort. But Martin's eyes simply wouldn't allow that to happen. Adopting the communal gaze enabled students to connect Martin's killing in a predominantly white neighborhood to deeper reflections on the challenges that Black people face in navigating predominantly white spaces. Notably, looking at Dylan Roof's photograph provoked equally visceral responses and deep challenges to the students. All white, understandably, the Black student did not look at that photograph, who spent time with him. For several, the aversive gaze acted in how they initially looked or avoided looking at this image. They did not want to look at Roof or at the Confederate flag in the photograph, given what it stands for. But they also recognized that to give in to the aversive gaze was to refuse ethical responsibility. 3 of them used the occlusive gaze for their second viewing of Roof, looking elsewhere and, quote, contemplating the image from memory, unquote, as one put it, rather than looking at it. However, the feelings from the first viewing, quote, disgust, outrage, and deep distress at what human apathy is capable of, unquote, as that student went on to write, remained strong. It was as though Roof's photograph haunted these viewers even in its absence. Applying the communal gaze to this photograph prompted students to reflect on the likely similarities and differences in their upbringings, and the spaces and places, including faith communities, where they had grown up, in the ways those spaces and places informed them. For one student, the liminal gaze morphed into the virtual gaze as they emplaced themselves in that scene, imagining additional details. For 2 students, adopting the communal and liminal gazes prompted a degree of compassion for Roof, given what he lost in giving himself over to violent white supremacist ideology. And that was a view that disturbed some of their colleagues. Motivated by the theological conviction that no human being is irredeemable, a theological conviction that was grounded in this student's work of reforming incarcerated men. A 3rd student took the bold and very difficult step of adopting the devotional gaze to look at Roof's image. Continuing to look more deeply into the photo, especially into Roof's eyes, proved extremely trying, but the student persisted. Roof's eyes, which initially looked essentially dead to the student, as to other students as well, took on something of the compelling power of a religious icon. Roof's gaze seemed to be calling out to viewers to join his cause and warning those who resisted it of the dangers of being, quote, on the wrong side. A look that the student realized some viewers would find compelling. The New Zealand Mosque murder for one. And the student's concluding reflections are really worth quoting in full and listening to. Quote, I ask him to see me as I am in front of him. I feel so sad, such despair, but I keep looking. I'm not stopping, I tell him. I'm with you as you are, but I would rather be with you as you might be. I will last as long as you do. He looks both large and small. I try to be with both sizes of He continues to refuse to connect with me. He is irredeemable on this planet. I leave, but I do not relent. But I feel so very sad, but perhaps more honestly so than after viewing the photo the first time in class. Isn't that powerful? Okay, so some concluding thoughts. My students' responses and reflections confirmed my hope that this visual repertoire can indeed jumpstart photographic insurrection. The ease with which the students engaged with this visual repertoire, both to describe how they first looked at those images and then to re-engage them, confirms that its gazes do indeed come naturally to us, even when used for visual encounters with non-religious visual objects. And the students' reflections also confirm that using religious gazes can disrupt the hierarchy of seer over seen that is so central to normative gazes. In every case, it was clear that the gazes were indeed generative for the students, that they opened up new ways of relating to the photographs that didn't occur to them at first glance, even when that first look, typically at Martin's photograph, was a lingering and reflective one. Their responses also confirm that these gazes can prompt seers toward deeper and often difficult reflections on what encountering a certain visual image opens up and opens onto in themselves and in the larger world. Most importantly, these students weren't just moved emotionally. They were moved to be better and do better. To take action against systemic racism and its effects, or at least so they would believe. What actions they will take, whether they will amount to more than, just being good white people, so to speak, remains to be seen, and likely not by me. And the degree to which they would credit the experience of deliberative seeing for those actions as well, I don't know. Still, the promise is real. I'm going to close with a couple of quotations and talk about them as ways of kind of pulling all of this together a bit. The scholarship I referenced at the beginning of this talk highlighted the challenge and opportunities that our visually saturated new public square offers us when it comes to social justice issues. And that those challenges and opportunities, I think, that are proposed by our virtual world are captured really well by this quotation from a more recent book by Harry. Human beings live in a world that is simultaneously real and virtual, material and symbolic, sensate and mediated. Studies document the critically important relationship between seeing and cognition, memory, thoughtful reflection, versus simply more reflexive responses. As manifested in judgment. How can we make the most of that relationship, given our digital visual culture? How can we become the global citizen witnesses, the global witness citizens that NIAR calls us to? The novice organizers, in some cases, who are so moved by what they see that they take positive and actually impactful action. This quotation is from a very famous public intellectual, Susan Sontag, who wrote about photography a lot. This is from her book on photography, or on photographs. She died before digital photographs really were a thing, so she's writing about analog photography. But I think she also captures, a good bit of what it is that the photographs offer us, and also the challenge. And she writes, photographs trade simultaneously on the prestige of art and the magic of the real. They are clouds of fantasy and pellets of information. digital photographs that saturate our new public square are one very complicated resource in this endeavor, and Sontag's quote, I think, captures that. Cultivating photographic insurrection will require, I suspect, that we adjust not just how we see, but how we live. Instead of scrolling through news feeds, looking for that next high, we will need to slow down and really look at least some of the photographs that saturate them, especially those that capture our attention because they evoke social justice issues. Only by doing so will we be able to see in the clouds of fantasy and pellets of information that such photographs contain connections between self and other, between previous instances of violence and violation, and this one, between who we are and who we want to be.
Thank you again, Dr. Armour. So we have some time for some Q&A, but because of the sound and the recording, I would like to get the questions captured via mic. So I'll walk around and pass these out. But if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, please indicate, and I will bring you a microphone. All right.
Hello? Okay, I just want to make sure this is good. Okay. My name is Braden Watkins. I am a philosophy student here at American University. I had a question about what is perhaps a more modern development of photography. With what sort of, how might, forgive me if this is phrased haphazardly, but how might we view photographs like internet memes or stock footage, which relies on captions or artificial contexts to evoke meaning that is not intended by the photographer or represented in the photo itself?
I love that question. I think it's really interesting. One of the things that it shows us is, again, this prestige of art and the magic of the real, right? And clouds of fantasy and pellets of information. It also shows us that, I wish I could think of this title of the book, I can't think of it right now. But how really truly subjective our interpretation of the photograph can be, right? And I think and it shows also the importance of words. Very few photographs that we see are unaccompanied by words. That's true in social media, but it's also true in legacy media too, right? And those words try to control how we see and what we think. So I think we can. One of the things that I like about memes is it's a meme, right? You know it's a meme, so you know that they're playing with something, right? And it's not claiming to be a documentary photograph. So I think it actually can be a really good exercise to wrestle with a meme and what it's trying to do and what it's trying to say. Pushing back on it sometimes, but it can be a very good exercise because that's when you know what's going on. That's at least what my advice.
Hi, good evening. My name is Grace. I am a religious studies minor. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I also had another question about words. Going back to a previous statement that engagement increased when certain emotional phrases were used, and the fact that these social justice movements, political movements online are often accompanied by hashtags or common phrases. I was wondering what your thoughts were, if there's some sort of religious element to repeating phrases, kind of like chants, in protests or online and stuff like that, and what that would mean.
I think that's absolutely right. I never thought about that before, but I think that is absolutely right. That there is a kind of religious dimension to that, and a religious dimension too is singing too. Both of those things. Which is again why, if we go back to Morgan, who's talking about religious seeing engages the whole human sensorium. It's not just about vision. It's about hearing. It's about feeling. It's about everything. It's about proprioception, even, how we carry ourselves in the world. And I think that's an absolutely critical piece of it. Particularly when you think about the role that chanting together, right, singing together has. That kind of creates a sense of community. That may be a sense of community that's coming together, say, around a visual image, but it won't have that sense of community quite the same way without that oral dimension to it. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think that's really important. And it also points out, I think, yet another one of the limitations to social media, because we can't really quite do that on social media. I mean, I could sing along in my shower with, Randy Carlisle as much as I want, but it is not the same thing as doing that in the concert at Red Rocks. That's just not the same thing. So,
Hi, my name is Ethan, and I study education policy and also teaching. And I want to say, the point you brought up on, check my notes, sorry. On photographic insurrection really reminds me of Mariana Ortega's article discussing the idea of aesthetic unsettlement.
yes.
And I wonder how much this idea of kind of focusing and emphasizing this thing that is so distinct from our experience and focusing on the other, how this is affected by AI and its ability to kind of become more and more representative, or at least build on our usage of photographs in this kind of culture that's both trying to capture but also sensationalize a moment. And I wonder if this ability to recreate that with even more power than we have before, do you think it will allow us to, expand our imagination, this magic, and put more of this wonder into the hands of the average person, or if you think it is something that maybe will work towards desensitizing us towards these things that we are trying to capture.
I think probably all of the above are. It's too soon to tell, for sure. But I would say, and this is true of any technology. I was telling students earlier today. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but another example of algorithms of oppression, so to speak, is the Google Pixel camera. When it was first invented, it took several years before Google figured out that camera did not do accurate representations of the skin colors of people of color. That it was terrible at that. Now, you would think that anybody with half a brain would have said, okay, we want a global audience for this phone. We want everybody to buy it. So we better make sure that this camera works for a global population. That would not be a hard reach, I don't think. But that's not what they did. And I bring up that example to say, this is the thing with technology. It doesn't matter what the technology is. It is all ultimately human created. Now I know AI is going to go off and do its thing, right? And AI is learning very fast, but the foundation of what it's learning is still human. And so what that means is it's going to have the potential to be as fabulous and fantastic and wonderful and compassionate and inspiring and imaginative and creative as we are. And it's going to have the capacity to be as cruel and vicious and mean and snide and snaky as we are. And it's going to be up to us in the end to figure out how to use it ethically, hopefully. Some of us won't. How to use it ethically and how to engage with it in a way that helps us guard against some of those really its worst tendencies, our worst tendencies, because that's what it is. Because I think it's going to do the same thing, just as the digital camera, as I say here, amplified and accelerated the issues around photographic truth and photographic affect that were already true and analyzed. AI is going to be that on steroids, you know? And I'd like to think we can count on, you know, our legal system maybe to set up some guardrails of sorts, but we haven't seen that work very well either on social media. So we're always going to be playing catch up, I fear, in relationship to this thing. It's a good question.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a philosophy student. Thank you so much for your talk. I remember early on you mentioned that while photos often affect their viewers, this is less true of videos. Do you feel like your alternative religious ways of seeing are also applicable to videos, or is there something about, say, the stillness of a photograph that enables us to adopt these other ways of looking?
I lean toward the latter, that there is something about the stillness of a photograph that offers us potential, you know, a kind of to take a deep dive in a way that a moving image just doesn't, because it's always moving us to the next thing, you know. We don't often think about this, but I write about in Signs of Wonders. I write about the advent of moving pictures, which is literally what they were called, and they were literally, you know, just like in a series. And you know, if you've ever seen old-fashioned film, like, you know, 16mm film, it's just this, and this. It's like, and you could cut out a still from any one of those, right? And I think that is kind of indicative of how we process those moving images. The technology's gotten a lot better now, right? We don't really even think about how that works. But it doesn't, moving images don't lend themselves to, for lack of a better word, contemplation in the way that still images can. Not that every still image does, it doesn't. But they just don't lend themselves to that. That doesn't mean they can't be potent when it comes to issues around social justice. That certainly we saw that to be true with the murder of George Floyd, for example, right? And they're going to have the same problems. Some people believed the young woman who took the video of that, and some people didn't. And videos are contested. Even police, you know, body cam videos. You know, that doesn't really do a whole lot to make people trust them. So I think I do think there is something special about the still photograph because of the fact that it's still, and because it demands that we be still if we really pay attention. That we really be still. And we look into it more deeply. And that just is not something that videos do for us. At least that's my sense.
Hi, my name's Emily. I'm a master's student actually in the Ethics, Peace, and Human Rights program that I'm currently taking a class with Dr. Bach. And related to what you were just talking about, being able to contemplate with a still photograph, one of the things that we talked about in class, I don't know, maybe it was last week, I'm losing track of time, but was that contemplative prayer is a way of attending to things, but that in doing and having that kind of practice requires preparation. And the way that you enter into that state is almost more important than actually doing it itself. So I was wondering, when you talk about, you know, more deeply looking and more deeply seeing, and some of this photographic insurrection, what do you see as like any necessary preparation before you sort of come to that exercise?
That's a really good question. I guess it's a couple of things. I think it's probably, you know, it would be great to have a healthy dose of emotional intelligence, a healthy dose of self-awareness too, and a healthy dose of skepticism about visual media, so that you have some guardrails of sorts that are set up to, this isn't exactly contemplative practice that I'm talking about, but some guardrails that are set up to prevent you from simply going down a rabbit hole. And I think actually there is some benefit to engaging with a variety of visual media frequently, all the time, right? So, you know, the fact that you scroll through your news feed, you know, it's called your feed, you know, but that you scroll through that so fast, whether it's on Instagram or social media, you know, or Facebook, is not a bad thing. I'm not suggesting what we need to do is slow down and look at every single picture. But when one catches us, right, just really captures our attention, particularly one that has to do with social justice issues, I think it's really important to stop and look seriously into. And that is going to involve more than, I mean, I've just talked about photographic inspiration in terms of how we can look. It'd be great if, you know, this visual repertoire went out into the world and everybody kind of picked it up and were like, oh yeah, I like this. I'm going to keep doing it. I think I used a liminal gaze just now. I believe that's what it was. But what's important is actually the fact that these gazes come naturally to us. It means we're probably already doing it. And if we slow down and look, we'll be doing it in the same kind of really more reflective way. And that can lead us down and into, you know, deeper investigations of, okay, what really is going on in this? What really did happen to children? You know, any of that stuff. So I guess it's a little different from contemplative prayer in that, in these ways. I don't think it requires that much preparation, so much as it requires taking advantage of the moment and really committing to looking, committing to slowing down when that happens, and committing to doing a deeper dive.
Hi, my name is Julie. I'm a philosophy student. I kind of wanted to sort of like, I guess, push back a little bit on, does it really have to be a image or a photograph? Because in a way, like a photograph represents an idea. Can it be applied? I guess the word gaze would have to be maybe reworded. Can it apply to more of what it signifies? Maybe can we view our own, I guess, stereotype or belief through these lenses and sort of as a way of like maybe deconstructing our own ideas or not necessarily have to be just strictly photographs, but you know, because I feel like at the end of the day, the purpose of that is really to get at what is beyond that photograph.
That's right. Yeah. I would totally agree with that. I think, and that's kind of what I mean by, and it's, I guess it's partly why I say jump-starting photographic insurrection, and I say probably more extensively certainly in the book, and you've heard it here, but that's just, you know, that's just a first step. And even you know, looking deeply is just a first step. What that has to do, if we're going to become, say, global witness citizens, global, right? We have to do things. We have to learn stuff, and that's going to require, you know, that's what I'm saying, a much deeper dive and paying attention to, lots of words probably. And I'm not saying either that photographs are the only things that can prompt that kind of reflection. That's definitely not true. But they are incredibly powerful resources, potentially, and resources that we sometimes take for granted and don't think about as resources for really prompting that kind of reflection and then action on the basis of reflection. So that's why I'm kind of focusing there and wanting us to think about that. That's a business these days.
Hi, my name is Annie. I'm an environmental studies student. With the amount of social media platforms, photos, news events, and just general activity going on in media in general, you talk about the art of the photograph and being able to reflect. Do you think it's possible that humans will eventually lose this ability to sort of reflect based on your concept of how we have moving photographs and how we have many videos. Do you think that the motion of everything happening so quickly will eventually impact our ability to reflect on these deeper social issues based on the still photograph?
I think you could say that's already happening, that our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And if you can't pay attention, you can't reflect, right? That's going to make the task of reflecting much more difficult. And I can promise you I teach students who are a little bit older than you, so I'm not seeing it as immediately as friends of mine who teach your generation are seeing it. But they're already changing the way they teach because they can't assign, 50 pages of book anymore and expect that students your age, I'm not sure all of you, sure, but that everybody will get out of that what they wanted them to be able to do. And that was, on the other hand, something you could assume, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I'm having to learn the same thing too, not partly from my students, but also because, we're trying to do some more public-facing educational opportunities, and that's what we're doing too. You can't put a video up there that's like 40 minutes, like a 40-minute lecture, and expect people to watch it all the way through. They're going to watch 10 minutes of it maybe, and then go do something else. So I think it's already happening. Now, what I don't think that necessarily means is that we are losing the ability to reflect on what we do pay attention to. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it is going to affect probably the skill with which we do it and the depth with which we do it, and that does concern me a little bit.
You mentioned a couple times the distinction between the sacred and the profane, and I'm wondering what the role of that distinction is in your thinking about photographic insurrection against biodisciplinary power. Is that important?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'm kind of pushing back on it a bit. Or using the distinction between the two a little ironically. In part because I want, we tend to think about the sacred as the set apart, and the profane is the nasty and dirty stuff. I'm talking about just now, not conceptually, but just kind of ordinary language. And I think that's actually a function of something like biodisciplinary power that makes us look at certain people or certain things and just think, yuck, and have a visceral response like that. So I guess, in here you can partly hear maybe my training by the feminist theologian Sally McClay, right, who talked about the world as God's body. If the world is God's body, and again she's focused on the incarnation, right, the claim that God became incarnate in Jesus, and she's saying, it's not, if the world is in some sense the incarnation of God, then the line between the sacred and profane is a very blurry one. And we have to, we would be better off, and her concerns are mostly ecological as well as feminist, but we would be a lot better off if we took the world as manifested in sacred in some ways, not as equating to. That's why she said the world as God's body, not the world is God's body, right? The world as God's body. And so that's kind of what I'm after too, is trying to disrupt that often line that's way too strongly drawn between the two. Does that make sense?
I think we're right at time actually, so will you join me again in thanking Dr. Armour for